This area isn't for you. Not a whisper, not pulled aside quietly, said out loud in the middle of a room full of people. Avery Thompson didn't step back, didn't flinch. She looked directly at Marjorie Klein, Director of Development at Ridgeway University, and said it clearly. "I received an official invitation by email." Marjorie didn't blink. "That must have been a mistake. These seats aren't allocated to students on financial aid." A few students nearby looked away, not out of embarrassment, because they'd seen it before. An event staffer stepped closer, voice smooth, almost polite. "Could you move back a little, just to avoid any confusion?" To avoid confusion, not to protect anyone, to erase her presence, quietly, professionally, without leaving a mark. Have you ever been in a room where every rule was technically followed, but the only thing treated as a problem was you being there? Avery Thompson, 22, senior, public policy major, partial scholarship. No title, no connections. At least, that's what everyone in that room assumed. She didn't correct them. She didn't need to. Because what happened next didn't start with who her father was. It started with what she had already done. Quietly, carefully, and completely on her own. And that's what they never saw coming. Ridgeway University didn't look like a place that excluded people. That was the point. The brochures showed students of every background laughing over laptops in sunlit common rooms. The website homepage rotated through faces, different skin tones, different zip codes, different stories. The admissions office called it a community built on merit, inclusion, and shared purpose. Avery had believed it. When she got her acceptance letter 3 years ago, she sat in the kitchen of her family's apartment in Arlington and read it 4 times. Not because she doubted it, because she wanted to hold on to the feeling a little longer. She had earned it. Every AP class, every late night, every scholarship essay where she had to explain her financial situation to a committee of strangers, she had done all of it herself. Her father had offered to make calls. She told him no. That boundary wasn't stubbornness. It was the only thing she felt was entirely hers. But Ridgeway had a way of reminding certain students of where they stood, not through policy, not through anything written down, but through the slow accumulation of small signals. The first time, she thought it was an oversight, a networking dinner for juniors. She never got the email. Her roommate, whose family had a building named after them 2 campuses over, got a printed invitation slipped under the door. The second time, she thought it was bad luck. A CEO roundtable limited to 20 students. The sign-up sheet appeared on a bulletin board in the development office hallway, a hallway Avery had no reason to walk down. By the third time, she stopped calling it coincidence. She started keeping a document, dates, events, who was invited, who wasn't. She cross-referenced it with the university's donor list, which was publicly available in their annual giving report. The overlap wasn't subtle once you knew where to look. She didn't tell anyone, not her roommate, not her academic advisor, not her father, especially not her father. She went to class. She worked her campus job 3 afternoons a week. She ate in the main dining hall, not the donor luncheon section, and she watched. The way you watch when you already know what you're looking at and you're just waiting for enough evidence to be certain. 22 years old, full course load, $17 left in her checking account until Friday, and a folder on her laptop that was getting harder to ignore. Avery had one rule she never compromised, not a rule anyone taught her, not something she read in a book or heard in a lecture. It came from watching what happened to people who leaned on the wrong thing at the wrong time, and then found themselves unable to stand without it. Her father was a powerful man. She had always known that, even before the appointment, before the title, before the press coverage. Ethan Thompson was the kind of person who walked into rooms and changed the temperature. Doors opened, calls got returned. Problems had a way of resolving themselves when his name was nearby. Avery had decided a long time ago that she would never use that. Not because she was ungrateful, not because she didn't love him, but because she understood something about borrowed power that most people didn't want to admit. It doesn't prove you're capable. It proves you have access, and those are not the same thing. She wanted to know, needed to know what she could do on her own, what she actually deserved, what she had actually earned. So the rule was simple. Don't pull him in until every other option is gone, not until it got uncomfortable, not until it got unfair, only when there was truly no other path, and even then, only as a last resort, not a shortcut. She had held that line through 3 years at Ridgeway, through the snubs, the overlooked emails, the networking events she found out about 2 days after they happened, through the slow, grinding humiliation of being made to feel like a guest in a room she had every right to be in. She held it because she believed something she never said out loud, not to her roommate, not to her advisor, not in any of her policy essays. She believed that systems don't change because someone powerful intervenes. They change because someone without power forces them to confront what they've been doing all along. That belief had never been tested at scale, until the afternoon Marjorie Klein put a hand on her shoulder and steered her toward the door, in front of everyone. And Avery realized she had been preparing for exactly this moment without knowing it. She had the folder, she had the dates, she had everything. Now she had to decide what to do with it. The deadline wasn't abstract. It had a date, March 15th. The Ridgeway Spring Opportunity Fair, the single most important networking event of the academic year. 43 employers, 11 federal agencies, 3 Fortune 500 companies that didn't recruit anywhere else on the East Coast. For seniors in public policy, it wasn't optional. It was the difference between graduating with a career path and graduating with a degree and a question mark. Avery had been planning for it since October. She had the right suit. She had her resume reviewed 3 times. She had researched every employer on the confirmed list and prepared tailored talking points for each one. She had done everything right, everything that was supposed to matter. Then, 2 weeks before the event, she found out. Not officially. There was no announcement, no policy memo, no honest explanation. She found out the way scholarship students at Ridgeway always found out, through the edges. A comment overheard in the development office hallway, a forwarded email that wasn't meant for her, a seating chart someone left face up on a table in the student center. Priority registration for the Spring Opportunity Fair was being routed through the development office first. Donor family students and students flagged on the funding network list got early access, better time slots, reserved tables near the stage, guaranteed one-on-ones with senior recruiters. Everyone else got the remaining slots, if any were left. Avery checked the public registration portal. Her time slot, 3:45 p.m. The event closed at 4 p.m. 15 minutes for a 4-hour event. She sat with that for a long time. This was the moment the rule became expensive. She could call her father right now. One conversation, probably one phone call from him to someone in this building, and her registration would be corrected by morning. Problem solved. No confrontation, no documentation, no risk. But if she did that, if she used that shortcut now, she would never know whether any of what she'd built over 3 years actually held weight. And more than that, the system would stay exactly as it was, fixed for her, intact for everyone else. The folder on her laptop had 41 entries now. March 15th was 13 days away. She opened a new document and started typing. 3 days before the donor circle luncheon, her phone rang at 7:42 in the morning. She was already awake. Campus job started at 8. She looked at the screen, saw the name, and let it ring. Not because she was avoiding him, because she knew if she picked up, he would hear it in her voice, the specific kind of tired that had nothing to do with sleep, and he would ask. And she wasn't ready to answer that question yet. She texted instead, "In class soon. Call you this weekend." He replied within a minute, "Okay, proud of you. Eat something." She stared at that for longer than she should have. Her father had always had a way of knowing when something was wrong without being told. She used to think it was a parent thing. Later, she understood it was something else, a skill developed over decades of reading rooms, reading people, understanding what wasn't being said. It was part of what made him effective at everything he did. It was also exactly why she couldn't talk to him right now. That same week, 2 things happened that she filed away without fully understanding why. The first, She was reviewing Ridgway's most recent federal compliance report, publicly available, buried in a footnote on the university's Office of Institutional Research page, and found a line item she hadn't noticed before. A $47 million federal research grant, renewed 18 months ago. The renewal documentation listed the Department of Education as the primary oversight authority. She bookmarked it, didn't know why yet. The second, a student she barely knew, a junior named Priya, quiet, always alone at the back of the dining hall, stopped her outside the library and said, almost in passing, "You're documenting it, aren't you?" Avery went still. Documenting what? Priya looked at her for a moment, then looked away. Nothing. Never mind. Good luck with everything. She walked off before Avery could respond. Avery stood on the library steps for a full minute after that, replaying the exchange. Priya hadn't asked if something wrong was happening. She assumed it, and she assumed Avery was already doing something about it, which meant she wasn't the only one watching. She just might be the only one willing to act. The choice came sooner than she expected. 2 days before the luncheon, Avery received an email from the Office of Student Affairs, a formal one, university letterhead, careful language. It informed her that her registration for the Spring Opportunity Fair had been administratively reviewed and her time slot adjusted to better reflect event capacity and flow. New slot, 3:50 p.m. They had moved her back another 10 minutes. She read it twice. Then she opened her documentation folder, added the email with a timestamp, and sat back in her chair. Here was the choice, stripped of everything else. She could forward that email to her father right now. Add a single line, "This is what's been happening," and let him respond however he saw fit. It would take 30 seconds. It would probably be resolved by morning. Or she could do what she had been doing. Keep building, keep documenting, file a formal grievance through the university's own process, the one they advertised in the student handbook under Equal Access and Institutional Fairness, and force them to respond on the record. The grievance process had a known outcome. She had asked around carefully, without revealing why. Every student who had filed one in the past 4 years received the same response: a form letter acknowledging receipt, a meeting with a mid-level administrator, and no material change. One student called it a place where complaints go to retire. She filed it anyway, because the point wasn't to win through that process. The point was to create a paper trail inside their own system, one they couldn't later claim didn't exist. When you're building a case against an institution, you don't just need evidence of what they did. You need evidence of what they did after they were told. Was she sacrificing the fair? Possibly. Was she gambling 3 years of preparation on a principle? Yes. She hit submit at 11:47 p.m. and didn't sleep well, but she didn't regret it. The grievance acknowledgement arrived 48 hours later. 1 paragraph, 4 sentences, exactly the form letter she had been warned about. Avery read it standing up, coat still on, bag still over her shoulder. She had just walked in from a 3-hour evening seminar on federal regulatory frameworks, the irony of which was not lost on her. And this was the first thing she saw when she opened her laptop. She sat down slowly. For the first time since she started the folder, she let herself think the thought she had been carefully keeping at the edge of her mind, just out of reach. What if this doesn't work? Not the grievance. She already knew the grievance was a paper trail, not a solution. But the whole approach, the documentation, the patience, the deliberate choice to stay inside legitimate channels and build something real instead of making one phone call. What if the system was simply designed to absorb exactly this kind of pressure? What if patience and evidence and principle were precisely the tools that institutions like Ridgway had learned to outlast? She thought about her father, not as the Secretary of Education. She rarely let herself think of him that way. She thought about him as the person who drove 4 hours to sit with her when she failed her first college exam, who never once said, "I told you so," and never once said, "Let me fix it," who had spent his entire career believing that institutions could be held accountable if you understood how they worked. She wondered if he still believed that. She wondered if she did. The clock on her laptop read 11:23 p.m. March 15th was 9 days away. If she called him now, she would be admitting that the system had won before it even had to try. She would be doing exactly what Ridgway's structure was designed to make her do: exhaust herself inside their process, then reach for outside help and give them grounds to reframe the whole thing as a personal dispute rather than a systemic one. She closed the laptop. Not yet, but the word yet was doing a lot of work tonight. She made a decision at 6:15 the next morning. Not emotional, not reactive. She had slept 4 hours, made coffee, and sat at her desk with the folder open and a legal pad next to it. She went through everything she had, 43 entries now, and asked herself one question: what is missing? Documentation of exclusion, yes. Time-stamped emails, yes. Cross-referenced donor lists, yes. The formal grievance and their non-response, yes. What she didn't have was live testimony. Real-time evidence of the exclusion happening in practice, not just on paper, something that couldn't be dismissed as misinterpretation or administrative error. She needed to be in that room. The donor circle luncheon was in 4 days. She had received an invitation. She still had the email, screenshot backed up in 3 places. They could call it a mistake all they wanted. She had proof it was sent. She had proof she was a registered student in good standing. She had proof the event was held on federally funded university property during a university-sponsored program. She was going, and she was going prepared. She checked her phone's native recording app. Audio quality, storage capacity, timestamp function. She tested it twice. She noted which pocket gave the clearest capture without visible obstruction. She reviewed Virginia's single-party consent law, which she had looked up 3 weeks earlier for reasons she hadn't fully articulated to herself at the time. One party to a conversation may legally record it. She was always one of the parties. She also typed a careful email to 3 classmates she trusted. Not explaining everything, but enough. I'm attending the luncheon Thursday. If anything happens, I may need you to confirm I was there and what you observed. She asked them to reply only if they were willing. All 3 replied within the hour. She wasn't building a confrontation. She was building a record. There's a difference, and that difference was going to matter enormously in about 96 hours. Thursday came. Avery arrived at the student center at 12:08 p.m., dressed professionally. Invitation email pulled up on her phone. Recording app running in her jacket pocket before she walked through the door. The luncheon was already in progress. Round tables with white linens, name placards, catered food that didn't exist in the regular dining hall. A stage set up at the far end with a podium and a banner that read, "Ridgway University, investing in tomorrow's leaders." She found her name on the general registration list posted near the entrance. She was on it. She walked toward the main seating area. That's when Marjorie Klein appeared. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. Avery knew this because her recording app logged the timestamp. Marjorie told her the area was for contributing families and funding network students. Avery cited her invitation. Marjorie called it a mistake. An event staffer suggested she step back. 2 students nearby looked away. One smiled. Avery didn't raise her voice, didn't argue past the point of establishing the record. She said, clearly and calmly, exactly what needed to be on tape. The invitation was official. She was a registered student in good standing, and she was being asked to leave a university-sponsored event on federally funded property based on her financial aid status. Then Marjorie placed a hand on her shoulder and began steering her toward the door. That was the moment everything shifted, not because Avery fought back, because a man standing 15 feet away, who had been watching quietly for the past 12 minutes, holding a takeout box and saying nothing, set it down on a nearby table and stepped forward. She hadn't known he was there. She hadn't called him. He had simply shown up. Ethan Thompson didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. Not yet. He stepped forward, placed himself calmly between Avery and the door, and spoke in the measured tone of someone who had spent decades in rooms where the wrong word could cost everything. I'm her father. I'd like to understand what legal criteria are being used to remove my daughter from a public event on a federally funded campus. Marjorie recovered quickly. She was good at this. Avery could see it. The micro-adjustment in posture, the slight recalibration of expression, the seamless pivot from authority to hospitality. "Sir, this is a private luncheon for a specific segment of our university community. Your daughter was informed. She was invited by official university email," Ethan said. "I'd like to see the written policy that supersedes that invitation." A beat of silence. Marjorie's eyes moved, just briefly, to the event staff nearby. A signal, the kind that didn't need words. Within 2 minutes, Dr. Caldwell appeared, Principal of Student Affairs, the second highest administrative authority on campus. He arrived with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to managing situations before they became incidents. He took one look at Ethan, one look at the small cluster of people watching, and made a decision. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice." Ethan hadn't raised it. "You're disrupting a university event. Visitor conduct regulations prohibit interference with scheduled programming. I'll need you to exit the building." Ethan looked at him for a moment, not with anger, with the particular stillness of someone running calculations. "I haven't raised my voice. I haven't touched anyone. I asked a question about written policy." He paused. "I also have audio and video documentation of everything that occurred in this room in the past 15 minutes, including the seating list on that table." He nodded toward it without pointing. "And the conversation between your staff member and the event manager 6 minutes ago." Caldwell's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "Security will escort you out." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's fine." He looked at Avery. One steady look, nothing more, and then at Caldwell. "I'll be outside." He left. But everyone in that room had just made a catastrophic miscalculation. They thought he was just a father. They thought Avery was alone. By Friday morning, the university had issued a response, not to Avery, not to her father, to the student body. A carefully worded all-campus email from President Hargrove's office, sent at 7:03 a.m. before most students were awake. Ridgeway University remains deeply committed to equitable access and inclusive programming for all members of our community. We are aware of concerns raised regarding yesterday's Donor Circle luncheon and have initiated an internal review. We ask that all community members allow this process to proceed with the integrity it deserves. Avery read it twice, then saved it to her folder. Internal review. She knew what that meant. She had studied enough institutional policy to recognize the architecture of self-investigation, a committee appointed by the same administration being investigated, operating under procedures written by that administration, reporting findings to the administration. The outcome was almost always the same. Not exoneration exactly, more like reframing. The language would shift. The conclusion would acknowledge areas for improvement, while carefully avoiding any admission that specific individuals had done anything wrong. It was a machine designed to absorb accountability without producing it. What made it more dangerous was that it was entirely legitimate. Every step would be documented. Every form would be filed correctly. The university's legal team would ensure that the process, whatever it produced, was procedurally unassailable. And meanwhile, the clock on the Spring Opportunity Fair kept running. 7 days. That same morning, Avery received a separate email, this one from the Office of Student Conduct. Her formal grievance, filed 6 days ago, had been escalated for review due to the increased visibility of related concerns. A meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday, 3 days before the fair. She was assigned a student advocate, a second-year law student named Marcus, part of the university's free legal assistance program. She met him in the library that afternoon. He was thorough, clearly well-meaning, and visibly uncomfortable when she laid out the full documentation. "This is a lot," he said carefully. "I know. The internal process has limited enforcement power. Even if they find in your favor, I know," she said again. He looked at her. "So, what are you actually trying to do here?" Avery closed the folder and looked back at him steadily. "I'm trying to make sure that when this goes somewhere with real enforcement power, every step inside their own system is already on the record." Marcus was quiet for a moment. You've been planning this for a while. It wasn't a question. Priya Nair found her in the library on Saturday afternoon, not by accident this time. She sat down across from Avery without asking, placed both hands flat on the table, and said quietly, "I want to tell you something, but I need to know it won't come back to me." Avery looked at her. "I can't promise that without knowing what it is." Priya nodded slowly, like that was the right answer, like she had been testing for exactly that. 2 years ago, Priya said, I filed a complaint with the Dean of Students' office. I had documentation, emails, a sign-up sheet, screenshots. I had everything. A staff member in the development office told me directly that the employer meet and greet was already at capacity. I found out later there were 11 empty seats. She paused. They told me my complaint had been reviewed and found to be based on a misunderstanding of event logistics. Avery didn't say anything. Then they called my academic advisor, not to discuss the complaint, to discuss my stress levels and whether I was adjusting well to the Ridgeway environment. Priya's voice stayed flat, controlled, the voice of someone who had processed this a long time ago and arrived at something colder than anger. I got the message. You stopped. I stopped. She looked at the table. I'm not proud of it, but I had a partial scholarship and a family that had never sent anyone to a school like this before. I couldn't afford to become a problem. Avery understood that completely. The calculation wasn't cowardice, it was survival arithmetic. The cost of fighting an institution that controlled your enrollment, your housing, your financial aid, your recommendations. The math was brutal, and the institution knew it. Why are you telling me now? Avery asked. Priya met her eyes. Because you're still standing, and because I think you have something I didn't. She paused. I don't know what it is, but whatever happened Thursday, whatever your father said before they walked him out, it was different. The way Caldwell looked afterward, he wasn't annoyed, he was calculating. She stood up, gathered her bag. I can't be a named source. I can't sign anything. I can't show up anywhere official. She said it without apology. But I wanted you to know you're not seeing things. It's real. It's been real for a long time. She left. Avery sat alone in the library for a long time after that, completely unsupported, completely on her own, or so it still appeared. 5 days before the spring opportunity fair, the university moved. Not visibly, not through any official announcement, through the specific kind of institutional pressure that leaves no fingerprints. Avery's academic advisor, Professor Langley, who had always been warm, always made time, sent her a calendar invite for Monday morning. No subject line. When she arrived, he didn't make eye contact for the first 30 seconds. I want to make sure you're doing okay, he said carefully. There's been some visibility around your name lately. I want to make sure that doesn't affect your focus heading into graduation. She recognized the structure of the conversation immediately. It wasn't concern, it was a weather report. Someone had talked to him. He was relaying the temperature without being able to say who turned down the heat. I'm focused, she said. Is there something specific you wanted to discuss? He shifted. The spring fair. I want to make sure you have realistic expectations about your registration slot. Sometimes these events, the later time slots, can actually be less crowded. Professor Langley, she kept her voice even. Am I in any academic difficulty? No, of course not. Is there a formal concern about my conduct or standing? No, Avery. Then I think I'm okay, she smiled. Thank you for checking in. She left his office and stood in the hallway for exactly 10 seconds, breathing steadily. They were applying pressure through every soft channel available. Advisor, scheduling, administrative process, each one individually deniable, collectively unmistakable. She had 4 days left. The internal grievance meeting was Wednesday. The fair was Friday. The university's internal review would almost certainly produce nothing actionable before either deadline. She had built the best case she could inside the system. She had documented everything. She had filed correctly. She had done it all without making a single call she wasn't supposed to make. But the system was closing around her in real time, and she could feel it. She took out her phone, looked at her father's name and her contacts. Didn't call. Not yet. But for the first time, she let herself think about what yet actually meant. Monday evening, she went back to the beginning, not emotionally, analytically. She opened the folder, 51 entries now, and read through everything in sequence, the way she imagined someone outside the situation would read it, someone with no stake, someone whose only job was to evaluate whether the evidence held weight. It did. But she also saw, for the first time with complete clarity, what she had been circling around for weeks without fully naming. This wasn't just a university conduct issue. It wasn't a grievance process problem. It was a federal compliance problem. Ridgeway University received $47 million in active federal research grants. It received Title IV student aid funds, the federal financial aid that made Avery's own enrollment possible. Both funding streams came with legally binding conditions. Non-discrimination in access to educational programs and activities, not just in admissions, in programming, in opportunity allocation. What Avery had documented, systematically over months, was a university using donor affiliation as a proxy for access to employer networking, career development events, and professional opportunities on federally funded property during university-sponsored programming. That wasn't a cultural preference. That wasn't optics management. That was potentially a Title VI violation with a $47 million leverage point attached to it. She had known this intellectually for weeks, but she had been so focused on the internal process, on doing everything right inside the system, that she hadn't fully assembled the external picture. She pulled up the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights complaint portal, read through the filing criteria twice. Her documentation met every threshold for a formal external complaint. The grievance she had already filed internally created the required record of exhausting internal remedies, or attempting to. She had everything she needed, except one thing. A complaint to the OCR would trigger a review process, slow, formal, procedurally rigorous. Months, possibly. The spring opportunity fair was in 4 days. The federal process wouldn't move fast enough to matter for Friday. But there was another pathway. Faster, more direct, one that didn't require her to file anything new, one that already existed, in the hands of someone who had been carrying a recording since Thursday afternoon. She hadn't asked him to hold on to it, he just had. The grievance meeting was Wednesday at 2 p.m. Avery arrived with Marcus, her student advocate, and a printed copy of every document in her folder, 51 entries, organized chronologically, tabbed, and indexed. The committee was 3 people, an associate dean she had never met, a faculty representative from the business school, and a staff member from the Office of Institutional Equity, whose expression remained entirely neutral for the duration of the meeting. They were professional, thorough even. They asked careful questions and took careful notes and thanked her for her detailed documentation. Then, 40 minutes later, they delivered their finding. The committee had reviewed the available evidence and determined that the events of the Donor Circle luncheon represented an isolated miscommunication in event coordination rather than a systemic policy of exclusion. The email invitation Avery received had been sent in error, confirmed, they said, by the event management software logs. Her registration slot for the Spring Opportunity Fair had been assigned through a neutral automated process. No discriminatory intent could be established. Her grievance was formally closed. Marcus put down his pen slowly. Avery looked at the 3 faces across the table. None of them met her eyes directly. "The seating list," she said. "The one marked Priority Donors. I submitted it as Exhibit F." "We reviewed all submitted materials," the Associate Dean said. "And the audio recorded by my father, the staff member who said development prefers optics, that scholarship students shouldn't dominate donor tables. That's Exhibit J. We're not able to incorporate materials collected outside the formal grievance process." Of course, materials collected outside the formal process. Evidence that existed, that she had submitted, excluded on a procedural technicality that had never been mentioned until this moment. She nodded once, stood up, picked up her folder. "Thank you for your time," she said. She walked out of the building into cold afternoon air and stood on the steps without moving for almost a full minute. 2 days until the fair. Grievance closed. Internal process exhausted. Every legitimate channel inside the system had now either ignored her, reframed her, or shut her out on a technicality. She had done everything right, built everything carefully, stayed inside every line, and the institution had looked at all of it. 51 entries, months of documentation, a formal recorded complaint, and simply said, no. She took out her phone. This time, she called. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey." His voice was careful, not surprised. She understood now that he had probably been waiting for this call for days, maybe longer. "Hey." She sat down on the steps of the building she had just walked out of. The afternoon was cold and gray and completely ordinary. They closed the grievance. A pause. "I know." She hadn't told him about the meeting, which meant someone else had. Which meant he had been tracking this more closely than she realized. Not interfering, not acting, but watching. The way he always watched. "Dad." She stopped, started again. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." "Always." "If I ask you to do something with what you recorded, not as my father, but through whatever channel is actually appropriate, will it hold? Is there enough?" He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, thinking. "The recording documents 3 things clearly," he said. "Explicit exclusion based on financial aid status, staff language about optics and donor preference in seating allocation, and a formal request for written policy that was never answered, followed by physical removal." He paused. "Combined with your documentation of the pattern over months and the university's $47 million in active federal grants. Yes, there's enough." She looked out across the empty campus walkway. "I spent 3 years making sure I didn't use you," she said. It wasn't an accusation, it was just true. "I know." His voice was quiet. "You were right to." "Was I?" "Yes." No hesitation. "Because now, when this moves, and it will move, no one can say it was manufactured. No one can say you ran to Daddy the moment things got hard. You built the case, every piece of it. I'm just the mechanism that puts it in front of the right people." She thought about Priya, sitting across from her in the library. I can't be a named source. She thought about every student who had done the math and decided the cost was too high. She thought about the associate dean who hadn't met her eyes. "Okay," she said finally. "Not as my father." "Understood," he said. "Not as your father." She hung up, sat with the silence for one long moment. Then she opened her laptop and started writing. Thursday morning, Ridgeway University received 2 simultaneous communications. Not 1, 2. Arriving within the same 40-minute window through entirely separate channels with no visible coordination between them. The first was a formal complaint filed with the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, submitted electronically at 8:47 a.m. under Avery's name, with 51 documented entries attached as supporting evidence, time-stamped emails, cross-referenced donor lists, screenshots. The formal grievance filing and the university's response, the committee finding that excluded audio evidence on procedural grounds. All of it organized, indexed, and submitted through the correct federal portal with the correct form numbers. The second communication arrived at 9:23 a.m. It was addressed to President Hargrove directly, not to the General Administration, not to legal counsel, not to the Office of Student Affairs, to Hargrove personally. It came from the Office of the Secretary of Education. It referenced, by grant number, each of Ridgeway's active federal funding agreements. It noted that the department had become aware of credible evidence suggesting systematic exclusion of financial aid recipients from university-sponsored programming on federally funded property. It stated that under the conditions of those agreements, the department was obligated to review the evidence and determine whether a formal compliance investigation was warranted. It requested that the university preserve all relevant records and communications pending that determination. It was not a threat. It was not a demand. It was a procedurally precise notification that the federal government was now paying attention and that the $47 million currently flowing into Ridgway's research infrastructure was attached to conditions the university had agreed to meet. Hargrove called an emergency session of the senior administration at 10 a.m. Avery wasn't in that meeting. She was in her 9 a.m. seminar, sitting in the third row, taking notes on federal regulatory compliance, still with full awareness of the irony, and waiting. She didn't have to wait long. At 11:15 a.m., the video leaked. She hadn't released it. She would never know exactly who did, whether it was someone in that emergency session who understood what was coming and decided to get ahead of it, or someone on the periphery who had been waiting for exactly this moment. It didn't matter. What mattered was that by noon, the full audio and video from the Donor Circle luncheon was circulating across student group chats, then across Twitter, then across 3 national higher education news outlets that picked it up before the afternoon was over. The recording was clear, devastatingly clear. Marjorie Klein's voice, unhesitating. These seats aren't allocated to students on financial aid. A staff member, quieter but audible. Development prefers the optics. Scholarship students shouldn't dominate donor tables. The seating list, briefly visible on camera, marked in the upper corner. Priority. Donor families and funding network affiliates. Dr. Caldwell's voice, arriving to manage the situation. You're disrupting a university event. And then, to security. Escort him out. And underneath all of it, steady, documented, impossible to dismiss, Avery's voice, calm, precise, never raised, citing her invitation, citing her standing, asking clearly and on the record for the written policy that justified her removal. There was no written policy. There had never been a written policy, because the system had never needed one. It had operated for years on the assumption that the people it excluded had no recourse, no record, and no one who would force it to answer. By 2 p.m., President Hargrove had issued a public statement suspending Marjorie Klein pending investigation. By 3 p.m., 3 other senior staff members had been placed on administrative leave. By 4 p.m., the university's legal team had contacted the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights to confirm full cooperation with the federal review. Avery found out about most of this through her phone, sitting in the student center, the main one, not the donor section, with her laptop open and her documentation folder closed for the first time in months. Her phone was full of messages, classmates, students she barely knew, a junior who had been excluded from a networking event 2 semesters ago and never said anything, a first-generation sophomore who wrote simply, "I saw the video. Thank you." Priya texted one line, "I should have done this 2 years ago." Avery looked at that message for a long time. Then she looked around the student center, at the tables, at the students eating and studying and moving through their ordinary Thursday afternoon, and thought about how many of them had done the math and decided the cost was too high. How many had swallowed it? How many had adjusted? She hadn't won because her father was powerful. She had won because she had built something that power could act on, but couldn't manufacture. Before anyone could take credit for what happened, the evidence had already existed for months. The only question that had ever mattered was whether someone would force the system to look at it. What would you have done if you had the evidence, but using it meant risking everything you'd built? The Spring Opportunity Fair happened on Friday. Avery attended with a 9 a.m. registration slot, reassigned the previous evening by the university's interim event coordinator, who sent the confirmation with no explanation and no apology. She spent 4 hours talking to employers, federal agency representatives, and recruiters who had no idea what had happened the day before and didn't need to. She got 3 follow-up interviews. One of them was with a federal policy office she had been trying to reach for 2 years. She didn't tell anyone that part for a long time. It felt important to keep it separate, to make sure that what happened Thursday didn't become the reason Friday worked. She needed to know the interviews stood on their own. She believed they did. In the weeks that followed, the federal review moved with unusual speed. The Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights opened a formal compliance investigation into Ridgway's programming allocation practices. The university, facing potential suspension of its federal funding agreements, did not contest it. An independent audit was commissioned. The donor priority seating system, never written down, never formally acknowledged, operational for at least 6 years, was documented in full for the first time. 3 structural changes were mandated before the next academic year: transparent, publicly posted registration procedures for all university-sponsored events, removal of development office involvement in student programming access, and an independent ombudsperson for financial aid students with direct reporting authority outside the administrative chain. Marjorie Klein did not return. Dr. Caldwell resigned in April, citing personal reasons. Priya Nair submitted a formal account to the federal investigation. She was not the only one. 11 other students came forward with documented experiences spanning 4 academic years. Avery graduated in May. No ceremony, no statement, no interview. She had been asked for several. She declined all of them. She called her father that evening from the parking lot outside the venue, still in her cap and gown, sitting on the hood of a car that wasn't hers because she didn't own one. "I need you to know," she said, "that I'm glad you were there. I'm glad you held on to the recording, but I need you to know I would have found another way." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "That's why I waited. There are systems in every institution, in universities, in workplaces, in places that call themselves inclusive, that operate not through written rules, but through the quiet assumption that certain people won't push back, won't document, won't know the right channels, won't have anyone paying attention." Avery Thompson was 22 years old, $17 in her checking account, and completely alone, right up until the moment she wasn't. The system didn't fall because someone powerful intervened. It fell because one person refused to let it stay invisible. If you've ever been made to feel like you didn't belong in a room you had every right to be in, this story was for you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if it made you think, leave a comment below because this conversation is just getting started.